everybody will be muted so that Steve can get things going. And if you don't want to be on the recording, I would suggest turning off your camera at this point, because we will be recording this and it will be available for people to view later on. So just so you know, if you don't want to be on the recording, go ahead and turn your camera off. We'll edit out this part, but for when the
The audio is
presentation's
off.
actually happening. All right, just for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Kevin Unrath. I'm the consultant for library operations. Also with us is Lauren Kelly. She's been really the lead on this project over the last year or so, and so I just wanted to recognize the work she's done, both to help with these schedules and also to help set up this training. So thank you so much for that, and for being here, Lauren. And now I'd like to introduce Steve Picazio. Um, Steve works for the VSARA, which I will let him explain, but he is also a librarian, so he comes from our world as well. So he really has great knowledge of both the record schedules and also what goes on in libraries. So I'm not going to take up any more time. I'd like to turn it over to you, Steve, to walk us through these new retention schedules for municipal libraries.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. I am going to share my screen so you can see my slides. And let's see here. Go. Okay. So thank you again, Kevin. So my name is Steve Picazio, and I work for the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, or VSARA. And today, the topic of the presentation will be records retention for public libraries. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about record schedules, as Kevin mentioned, and we're going to be looking at how you make decisions about retention for the different types of records that your library has. So to explain a little bit about why I, from VSARA, am talking to you about this, actually, before I jump into that, let me just give you a quick overview of what I'm going to be covering in today's presentation. So we're going to be looking at an overview of records management laws and best practices that are applicable to public libraries in Vermont. The title of the presentation is Records Retention. You'll hear me use the term records management often. That's just a broader term that covers records retention and other things related to records. We're going to look at how the term public record is defined in Vermont and how that's applicable to your work. We're going to become familiar with the municipal libraries record schedules, these new record schedules that were issued to libraries back in June. And we're going to look at how you can develop a records retention policy for your library. And then we're going to walk through the process of applying the record schedules to determine retention and building out your records retention policy. So what is VSARA, and more specifically, what is the Vermont Local Records Program? So the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration is tasked with providing state and municipal agencies with records guidance and assistance. And then we break that down so that the Vermont Local Records Program specifically looks at that municipal level. So we're talking municipal government officials, public schools, public libraries, anything else that falls under the umbrella of municipal government. We work with any of those groups, and we develop defensible record-keeping requirements, and we also develop trainings and tools that you need so that you can apply these requirements. So public libraries in Vermont are a little different from some of the other municipal agencies that we work with, like town clerks or public schools, because public libraries fall into three different categories. There are municipal public libraries. These are public libraries which are administrated as part of municipal government. There are community or joint school public libraries, which again fall under an administrative organization of being part of the municipal government and part of the public school system. And then there are incorporated public libraries, and these are independent, not-for-profit organizations. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the Public Records Act. I'm going to be speaking a lot about the record schedules. For those municipal and community public libraries, the Public Records Act fully applies to you, and the record schedules are fully applicable. If you're joining us from an incorporated library, you can take the record schedules that I'm going to be talking about and the records retention policy and use it as a best practice in developing your own retention guidance. So we do feel that it offers you definitely some good guidance to start with. Legally speaking, it just holds a different place in your operations. So an introduction to records management in Vermont. Since I'm speaking with information professionals, the question of why should public libraries manage their records may seem foolish. I assume you all have a natural inclination to manage your records, but the other question that I'm trying to get at here is what do the laws say about what you need to do in terms of your records? What responsibilities do you have? So first, let's ask the question of what is a public record? So a public record in Vermont is covered by Statute 1 VSA 317, and it includes any written or recorded information, regardless of physical form or characteristics, which is produced or acquired in the course of a public agency's business. So the key things to look at there are we're talking about regardless of physical form or characteristics, so electronic records and physical records. And then anything which is produced or received by a public agency, which a public library would, municipal or a school municipal public library would qualify as a public agency. So essentially what the law says is if you receive a record, that's a public record. If you produce a record, that's a public record. But if the term public record maybe seems strange for your consideration as a public librarian, you're thinking about all of those patron records that you have, and you don't just hand those out to anybody who asks. When we think of public records, even though something may be a public record, there may be exemptions that apply to who has access to public records. So 1 VSA 317C covers some common exemptions, and then there are specific exemptions throughout the statutes. 22 VSA 172 covers specific exemptions related to patron records. There are other specific examples that may be applicable to the records that you have. So we know that the law says that anything and everything that you produce or receive is a public record. What are you doing with these public records? What are the expectations? So the Public Records Act, which is mostly covered in 1 VSA 317A, says that public records are especially important for municipal employees to understand because you are responsible for the public records that your office creates or receives during the course of your work. And your overarching mandate is to manage your public records. More specifically, you are expected to manage them systematically, which means through a planned and structured manner to better support efficient operations, reduce costs, promote access, and to protect the legal, administrative, and informational value of public records, particularly those with enduring and long-term value. And this same statute also speaks to the disposition of public records. So that section B there, which says a custodian of public records shall not destroy, give away, sell, discard, or damage any records in his or her charge unless specifically authorized by law or under a record schedule that has been approved by a state archivist. So another way of saying that is you are constantly receiving and producing records, which are public records, and then the law says that you have to follow either a specific law or a record schedule when making the determination of whether or not you can destroy those records if they've met their retention. So what does systematic management mean? So in statute, records and information management is described as efficient and systematic in that it's a control of a record from creation or receipt to its full disposition, which often means destruction, but sometimes maybe permanent preservation. This definition, which aligns with the industry-wide understanding of records and information management as a discipline and professional practice, identifies that systematic management is not just about storing records, but about how they're being created and used, as well as their eventual disposition. Records and information management is systematic because it establishes control over information through careful planning, which is built on documented policies and procedures. The decisions underpinning records and information management activities, including policy development, which we'll talk a little bit about, are also going to be thought out with business analysis, legal record keeping requirements, and a review of the records resulting from these processes serving as their foundation. Importantly, since systematic management is going to be affecting records from creation to disposition, systematic records information management programs and policies are actively maintained and have top-down support to ensure that they are comprehensive in scope and actually work. A long way of saying we need to think about the full lifespan of a record, how it's being created or received, what's being done to it as it's an active record, how we're making determination of whether or not it can be dispositioned or not. And this should all be documented in some sort of a policy so that anybody who's asking us, what are we doing with their records? We have documentation to show how we're making these decisions. So why is records information management important? So when an organization is fully aware of all of its records and is managing them comprehensively, it will have the structure, policies, and procedures needed to support operations beyond storage and retention. For example, records information management is an essential component of disaster preparedness and recovery. While never easy, recovery efforts are more efficient and timely in mission-critical records if mission-critical records are stored appropriately and if they are readily accessible and reliable backups are available. Neither option is going to be possible without proper management. Records information management also reduces your legal risks. When you rely on legal and defensible timeframes for the disposition of your records, then you will mitigate legal risks for anybody challenging your disposition of records. And you're also going to be protecting the sensitive information in those records with exemptions from public exposure. And records information management makes sharing information internally, externally easier, faster, and more efficient when you know where the records are and who should have access to them and what you're doing with them. All right, so that's a really quick run through of some of the broad legal requirements related to records management. And the reason why I wanted to provide that is I wanted to provide some sort of background on what a record schedule is and why it exists. So the record schedules act as the foundation for your records management and retention. So this past June, there was a bundle of record schedules that were issued specifically for municipal public libraries. And so what a record schedule is it's an official policy tool that ensures systematic management and provides an agency, in this case a public library, the authorization to manage and disposition records appropriately and transparently. Record schedules are drafted collaboratively with agency stakeholders and Visara staff. So in this case, we worked with public librarians, we worked with members of the Department of Libraries, and we collaboratively discussed the records that public libraries deal with and determined appropriate retention for those records. And we'll get into more details on where you can find that full idea fleshed out in the record schedule. The record schedules are issued as two different types. Today, I'm going to be focusing on specific record schedules, the specific record schedules that were issued for public libraries. These are the record schedules that are going to cover the records that are unique to your institution, and they can only be used by the institutions that they were issued to. So there's, as I was saying, a bundle of record schedules issued to public libraries. They wouldn't be appropriate for use by your municipal clerk. They're only for municipal libraries to use. There are also general record schedules that cover common functions and activities that are carried out by multiple public agencies. So there are general record schedules for things like budgeting records and accounting records and payroll records and lots of different things that may or may not be applicable depending on the functions that you oversee and are responsible for at the library. I'm not going to get super into detail about the general record schedules just as a time concern today, but they are available and those can be used by whichever public agency is appropriate for them. So in the record schedules, you are provided an overview of each record's life cycle. And in addition, you are given specific retention requirements for each record. These record schedules are written to apply to end records in any format. So they're not specifically about electronic records or specifically about physical records. They're going to be applicable to whichever format those records are in. The record schedules are going to define which records are temporary and which records are permanent, and they're going to demonstrate compliance with the Public Records Act, that one VSA 317A, when you cite them in your records management policy. So this is what a record schedule looks like. This is the second page from the record schedule bundle that was issued to public libraries. The first page provides all of that legal background on what a record schedule is and why it exists and what it's doing. And then this first page gets into the first record schedule, and I want to take a few minutes to walk you through what you're seeing and what it's telling you. So at the very top of the page, you'll see a number here. So SRS, specific record schedule, followed by a series of 4 numbers, and then a title for the record schedule. So that SRS and the numbers, that's a specific number that identifies this record schedule. You'll see me use it as shorthand, a shorthand way to indicate a specific record schedule. And then the record title is next to that, the record schedule title. So in this case, we're talking about the municipal library patron records. So this record schedule is going to cover that. So underneath that in the italics is the scope statement. And the scope statement is going to define what we mean when we are talking about municipal library patron records. So which records does that include? So in this case, we're talking about records that provide evidence of activities and transactions that relate to or affect the management of library patron registrations and transactions. A little further down, we see the retention section. This provides a summary of the information found in the table at the bottom of the page, and it provides necessary clarity on retention of different record types covered in this record schedule. The first time that you read through a record schedule, I strongly advise reading this section because it's going to, again, summarize the different retentions for different record types. It's also going to provide it in slightly different language, which may be helpful in understanding the retention periods. So in addition to providing retention periods for records, record schedules also provide public access guidance. So again, we're dealing with public records. So if you're answering a public records request or you are trying to figure out who should have access to these records, this public access section here is going to provide you with some general guidance for that. So in this case, the records covered in this record schedule are going to be exempt from general public access. And this is, again, the summary section. When we get into the table, we'll look at public access guidance for specific record types. And so this box here indicates that these are the specific record keeping requirements because this is a specific record schedule. The retention requirements listed below are the expectation and aren't intended to be flexible, meaning that once these records have met their retention, they should go through the disposition guidance provided. If this was a general record schedule, there would be some different language to indicate that those are the minimum retention requirements and that you may need to go longer in your retention for those records for administrative needs. That's one of the significant differences between a specific record schedule and a general record schedule. So when we get down into the chart, this is the meat of the record schedule. This has the specific information that you're probably looking for. The first column here has the record type. So we're talking about records that fall under this concept of municipal library patron records. And within this big group of records, there are specific record types. And these different record types are going to have different retention requirements and maybe different public access codes and these sorts of things. So this is where we break down all those differences between the record types that fall under this bigger category of municipal library patron records. So this example that's circled here is the applications. So we're talking library patron applications. You'll see above applications, there's SRS followed by a string of numbers. That's a specific number that we can point to so that we're saying specifically the applications record type within the library patron records record schedule. And then below applications, you'll see a public access guidance for this specific record type. In this case, it's going to be exempt. So next to that is an applicability and use statement. And this is very important because when I'm talking about a library patron record application, that's probably makes sense to you, but some of these record types may not. When we develop a record schedule, we're using a controlled vocabulary. We're using very particular terminology for these record types, and understanding what we mean by an application as it relates to a library patron versus an application that might come up in a different record schedule. That's where this applicability use statement is going to provide some clarity. What are we talking about when we talk about an application related to a library patron record? Next to that is the appraised value. This tells you two things. The first thing is whether or not it's a temporary or a permanent record. And then the next thing is whether or not this record was whether or not this record has a specific legal requirement related to it, or whether or not, as we built out this record schedule, we became aware of this record, not because it's cited in a specific statute or rule, but because when we talked to the librarians, they told us that these records exist and they needed to provide some retention guidance for these records. And then finally, we get into the actual retention and disposition guidance. The idea of this section is we're going to speak to the full life cycle of the record. So it's going to break down the actions you're going to take with those records into multiple steps. So the record is created or received, and then it has a certain lifespan until you hit this retain until point. So a patron fills out a library card application, and then you're going to retain that application until completed closed, until the processes that you need to do with that application have been fully completed and closed. Then it's going to say plus, and for certain records, it might say plus 3 years, plus 5 years, plus 20 years, whatever would be appropriate. In this case, it's saying plus 0. There's no hold on to this record, even though you completed and closed the processes related to it, hold on to it for an extended period of time. And then after that plus has been met, then you can disposition the record. In this case, it's going to say disposition by shredding, destroy shred. If it were a permanent record, it would say then archives, as in then move it into permanent storage. All record schedules contain a series of appendices. The first 4 appendices lay out what a lot of the standard language that you'll encounter in record schedules means. So in that disposition section where we just saw in the past example, destroy shred, here's what we mean by destroy shred versus some of the other language that you'll see, destroy general, archives, etc. So those appendices can help you flesh out what these record schedules are saying. And then the final appendix in all of the record schedules is the legal citations. So as we build out record schedules, we look to any relevant statutes or rules, either from the state or federal level, that are applicable to the record types covered in that record schedule. And if there is a reason for an exemption or a redaction for public access to these records, that's going to show up here. So the reason why that particular record type is listed as an exemption is because this particular statute, 22 VSA 172, calls for library patron records to be confidential. So where can you find these record schedules that I'm talking about? Record schedules all exist on Vasara's website. The Vasara's website is broken down into 2 pages, one for general record schedules and one for specific record schedules. In the specific record schedules page, the library's schedules are listed under municipalities. So what record schedules were issued to libraries? There were 4 record schedules issued to libraries to cover library-specific records. The first was administrative policy records. These are going to be records that relate to activities or transactions that relate to or affect the administration of a public library, the public library's board of trustees, and or the formation or development of policy. So top level records, records that are dictating major administrative and policy decisions. Then there's municipal library transitory records. So these are records that are created or received in the course of business that are transitory in nature, meaning that they are only needed for a limited period of time in order to complete a routine action or prepare or update a formal ongoing record, not subject to any legal record keeping requirements, and administratively obsolete after a specific action is taken. So because the Public Records Act says that everything you receive or produce is a public record and you cannot disposition a public record unless there's a specific statute or record schedule, we do have to always issue out a transitory record schedule to cover really mundane and basic stuff that maybe you're already deleting anyway because it's just a really routine email. But there does need to be an actual record schedule that says it is legally appropriate to delete routine correspondence and drafts. And we'll get into more specific examples of what is a transitory record. The third record schedule that was issued was for library patron records. So we talked a bit about that just a little while ago. So that's the records that relate to or affect the management of library patron registration and transactions. So check-ins and checkouts and people applying for library cards, that's those sorts of records. And then finally, there is a record schedule issued for library service records. So this is for records related to evidence or activities and transactions that relate to or affect the day-to-day operations of providing library services. These are going to include internal workflows and processes. It's going to cover your collection management records, things like this. So, those are the record schedules. And like I said, they provide the foundation for your records management approach because they're actually providing you with the legal guidelines to understand what records you need to retain, how long you need to retain them for, those sorts of pieces of information. But while the record schedules are 100% essential for record keeping, they only set forth those basic requirements. The key to constant records management, the key to actually meeting that systematic records management requirement from statute is having a written policy and procedure in place. And that's going to um, flesh out your records management approach so that you're fully meeting all the expectations and having this systematic and processes for your records management. So in order to do that, you need to have a records retention policy. So in short, the records retention policy is answering the question, what are you doing with your records and why are you doing those things? As part of the process of issuing out the record schedule, we were also able to work with the public librarians that we worked with and the folks at the Department of Libraries to issue out a template of a records retention policy for public libraries. This particular document will be provided after the presentation to all the attendees. This record is this policy example is intended to be easily edited and amended to meet your local needs. The things that have been highlighted are things that you would change to reflect your specific library. So what is in a records retention policy? So the example that we provide out, any municipal public library can use and adapt as a standard retention policy. Those incorporated public libraries can use this as a template as well, but you would want to change the references to the legal requirements of the Public Records Act. But a lot of what's in that policy is still going to be a usable template for you. And the different sections included in that policy, there's going to be purpose, scope, policy statement, pretty standard stuff for a policy. Then we're going to get into uniform laws and record schedules. So this is where we're going to point to those Public Records Acts, those what is a record schedule, explain that, those sorts of pieces of information aren't necessarily going to be common knowledge. If somebody does ask you for your records management policy, it's nice to pull all of that into short paragraphs to explain them. Also, if you're presenting this to your board of trustees, again, this just explains the background of your requirements as public agencies in managing your records. And then there's going to be a records management directive section. I'll talk a little bit more of that in the next slide. Revision history, pretty self-explanatory. If as you do make any sort of changes to this, you do want to record that in your revision history. And then there's going to be a couple appendices in the back, outline of applicable record schedules and information technology guideline. I'll talk a little bit more of those in a second. So the records retention policies, the Municipal Library Records Management Directive. This is the section where you get to set your own timeline for when you're going to review records and then disposition those records that have met their retention requirements. So this can be, you can set your own schedule for what would make sense. You're going to review your records once a fiscal year, once a calendar year, pick a month where things may be a little lighter in terms of your, workload, where you could do that disposition work, whatever really is appropriate for you. But that's what this section is intended to do. And then the appendices. So this applicable record schedule, really what this is a way for you to take the information from the record schedules, which we looked at earlier, and reformat it into a streamlined delivery of that information, which is going to be easier for your staff to understand and just kind of makes it a bit clearer, pulls away some of the other information from the record schedules, which isn't as applicable. And then finally, the information technology guideline. So as I mentioned before, the record schedules are format neutral. They're providing guidance for records based on the activity that they're related to, based on the subject that they cover. It has nothing to do with what format they come in. So oftentimes we're asked, well, how long do I need to keep an email? How long do I need to keep any, you name your electronic format a chat log if you're using something like Microsoft Teams or Slack or something so your staff can chat. So record schedules don't say retain emails for this long versus, retain chats for that long, etc. But it's good to have this sort of an appendix where you can say to your staff, your email communications are going to cover lots of different things. And if they're covering those transitory communications, um, that's great. Use the emails for that. But if they're covering something which has a longer retention, move those emails out of the actual email system and move it into a place where it's more appropriate for long-term storage, because it might have a very long retention, might even be a permanent record, depending on what the content of that email is, what activity it relates to. So this is where in this appendix, you can set some guidelines and expectations for your staff in terms of how you're using different technologies to manage your records. All right, so that was a really, really fast introduction to the record schedules and to a records management policy. So you have those two documents in front of you. How do you actually use them to make determinations about how long you should retain certain records? So we're calling this a crosswalk, where you're taking the record that you have in front of you and you're looking at the record schedules and trying to figure out, how do I put these together so that I'm retaining this record for a defensible length of time? So here's a first example, an approved strategic plan. That's the record that we're trying to figure out a proper retention for. So this is a strategic plan that has gone through the full process and been approved by your board. Um, how do I know, first off, which record schedule to look at? Well, a couple of clues. One, this went through the board, so it's definitely a top-level administrative record, because that's primarily what the board is dealing with, that top-level administrative and policy work. Also, the intention of the strategic plan is to inform the future administrative decisions of the library. So first thing I'm going to do is take a look at that municipal library administrative policy record schedule. As I read through that schedule and I read through those different record types, I come across the record type plans reports, and that says used for strategic plans, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a really nice, clean connection. And I can say, this is where I'm finding my retention guidance for this particular record type. And what is that retention guidance? This is a permanent record. This should not be destroyed. This bottom picture I have, that's pulled from that Appendix A section. Again, just a different way to view and read the retention guidance from the record schedule. So another example. So as you were working before you got to the approved record strategic plan, you generated lots of drafts as you were getting to that final strategic plan, which should get approval. So now this strategic plan got approved, and you figured out that that strategic plan, that approved one, is a permanent record, but you've got a folder at your desk full of all the various drafts and the notes you took related to it and all that stuff. So what do you do with that draft? Well, now I'm going to say, well, this is a record that was was created as part of an ongoing process to create a more formal record. So I'm going to look at that municipal library's transitory records schedule. And when I start reading through the record types for that one, I see drafts, and this is going to be for preliminary or tentative versions of documents. So this isn't for the final version, this is for the preliminary version of those records. And the retention for drafts that are transitory is that they're temporary, retain until obsolete, and then destroy. So obsolete in this case is, when is it functionally obsolete to your operations? So if you've gotten to the point where you've had your final draft approved by the board, is the draft really doing anything for you at that point? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That's a determination for you to make. But if it isn't, then it's obsolete, and now you can destroy it. Destroy general, it doesn't actually have to be shredded. It can just be generally recycled. All right, and another example. So a library card application. So a patron completes a library card application. So this is one where this relates to a library patron and their transactions with you and the public library. So you're going to look at that library patron record schedule. As you look through that, you'll see a record type for applications. That's a pretty straightforward. That's a nice clean connection there. And then again, you're going to see that this is, in this case, a temporary record, and it's intended to be retained until completed closed plus 0, then destroyed by shredding. So completed closed, in this case, you have a certain process that you do when somebody submits a library card application. When all of those processes are completed, you've completed and closed that library card application. There is no plus, so it can be immediately destroyed, and it should be destroyed by shredding because it is a exempt from public access record, and it has material in it that would be exempt. All right, and then another example. Event attendance statistics. So let's say you're keeping statistics on who's attending your events so that you can develop out reports and new ideas about events that you're going to hold in the library. So this doesn't have to do with specific patrons. Rather, this is about your general operations of the library and the library services that you offer. So in this case, you would look to the municipal library services record schedule. And then as you look through the record types in that schedule, you'll come across one that will say reports. And the reports are to be used for internal reports, including statistical reports that are used to communicate and or document general management, internal workflows, and processes. So if that's why you're keeping these statistics, it's to inform, decisions you're going to make about how you're going to operate your public events in the library. It would fall neatly into this reports record type. So for that one, we're seeing that this again is a temporary record. You're going to retain until completed closed plus an additional 3 years and then destroy. So completed closed, you're generating these statistical reports whenever that information has been fully completed and closed. You've taken that information and made a decision based off of it, and you have fully wrapped up the work you've been doing in keeping these statistics. Then it's completed closed. And then in this case, it's calling for a continued retention of plus 3 years. So even though you've created these statistics and you fully applied them to your work, now you're still going to hold on to that record for 3 years. So as you manage that record, you need to know where that's being stored for 3 years. And then once that 3 years is up, you need to know where to find it so then you can disposition it. And in this case, it's going to be a destroyed general. It does not need to be shredded. All right. So let's talk a little bit in my last few examples about email. So again, just to reiterate, record schedules do not speak specifically about the format that a record is in: electronic, physical, email, chat, whatever it might be. So in this case, we're looking to determine how long should we retain an email from a patron asking for help accessing ebooks. So this is an email where what we're really talking about is something that falls under that situation where there's no specific legal record keeping requirements for this. This is not something that's going to have administrative impact, most likely, on how you're operating your library, and it really has a very limited applicability in terms of what you're doing. So this is going to be a transitory record schedule. When you look at the transitory record schedule, you'll see a record type that says correspondence routine. And this is going to be for correspondence produced or received that is routine in nature and not subject to specific legal record keeping requirements. So a lot of emails that people receive often fall into this correspondence routine. So basic questions about what type of services you offer, um, help with something that a patron is asking, and then a general reference question. You think about, again, this is produced or received, so emails from a vendor like Demco to tell you that they're having a sale, listserv emails. A lot of these things are just standard routine correspondence. They do not have long-term impact on the operations of your library. And so that's what's going to qualify as a routine correspondence, whether that comes in through email or some other form of communication. So the retention guidance is it's temporary, retain until obsolete, and then destroy. So a few ways to determine a few examples of when this particular email of a patron asking for help accessing ebooks may be obsolete. It could be immediately after you answer the question, or maybe you're keeping track of people asking for help specifically around ebooks because you're trying to develop a program to about, what people need to know about ebooks and how you can help them out and that sort of thing. So maybe you're just tracking those for a short period of time so you can develop this program. Then after you develop the program, then they would be obsolete. The point being, though, that these are absolutely temporary records and you can delete them based on the record schedule. And now an example of a email which is not um, transitory, it's not temporary, it's actually substantive. So an email from a library's attorney commenting upon the library's meeting use room policy. So let's say, as an example, there's been some sort of complaint or issue regarding the use of the meeting room. The board and the staff have taken up the idea of potentially changing the library's meeting room policy as a result. And then you sent a draft to the library's attorney for their opinion. That response that they're providing is going to have an impact on what that final policy is. And that is substantive to what that policy ends up being. So, and that we're going to look here, since this relates to a policy, to the administrative policy record schedule. And then within that record schedule, we see correspondence again, but in this case, correspondence substantive. And this is for correspondence transmitted or received that has significant administrative value and or documents policy development, which this would be an example of that. So the retention for this type of email would be permanent. This is a permanent record. And so this isn't something you would want to delete quickly. Rather, what we would recommend would be pulling it from your email system and putting it into a more permanent storage location for your electronic records, be that a shared drive or something like a Microsoft SharePoint if you're using something like that, wherever you're keeping your long-term electronic records. Right. So that's the end of this very quick and perhaps overwhelming presentation. And I do appreciate that there's quite a lot of information to digest in this. But what I would recommend as first steps, take a look at the record schedule and take a look at the records retention policy example, and start thinking about your records holistically. What records do you have? What records are you regularly dealing with? And slowly build out that records retention policy so that you're covering the records covered in that record, in the specific record schedule for libraries. And then maybe think about records that aren't covered by those schedules. And you might want to look at the general record schedules. You might want to reach out to us. Here's my contact information here for some guidance on those as well. And then generally speaking, we are here to support municipal employees and people in public libraries. So obviously feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. I think we have a few minutes. If anybody has any questions, I would be happy to try to answer them right now.
Steve, this is Kevin. Thank you so much for that presentation. I really appreciate it. There is a question. It looks like Abby has a question in the chat, and I'm going to let you answer that, but I just wanted to say thank you. So, can you
Great.
see the chat okay, Steve?
I can, yeah. All right. So how long should tax records be held, and what is the safest place to archive records? Should we utilize Google Drive or Dropbox or stay with paper? So tax records are going to fall under different general record schedules. In many cases, they're going to fall under the accounting record schedule, but if you're dealing with tax records as they relate to employees, you're going to look at payroll and personnel, those record schedules. Again, this is a situation where feel free to reach out to us with, I specifically have these types of tax records, and then we can hopefully point you to the correct record schedule. And then within that, get the appropriate retention. And then as far as the best way, the safest way to archive records. So a Google Drive, a Dropbox, is safe, but there's no 100% safe answer. So you're using a third party. The third party is managing the actual safety of those records, who gets access to them, maintaining those hard drives, all that sort of thing. So those are definitely good, but also appreciate that you're entrusting a third party in that. But a lot of times that's the best option that you may have, depending on your budget, depending on what your circumstances are. And then physical records. So if you're keeping physical records, again, that can be a perfectly reasonable way to do it. But do you have a place to store these where they are safe from the elements? So would they be in danger of being flooded? Would they be in danger of having insects get at them? Would they be in danger of a fire? Would they be in danger of being stolen? Or would they, so some things to consider with physical records. The key that I would stress is if you are dealing with records and they are being born digital records, it's generally easier to manage them as a digital record rather than printing them out and keeping them physical. But again, that's really a decision that you can make. There is often not a specific format required in statute. So that's a decision that you get to make. And I think we got some more questions in. Let me see. So how long should we save our annual statistics submissions? So for that, I would look to the administrative policy library records schedule. And I believe there's a record type for reports, and I would follow that, which was probably going to say either permanent or a very, very long retention. That's going to have long-term impact on the administration of your library. Can you address attendance statistics again? We have sign-in sheets for stats, but do not keep them after getting our numbers. Would you need to keep these for 3 years? So no. So if you're doing the sign-in sheets, those are going to be a transitory record that's then informing the statistics that you're keeping, whether that's in some sort of spreadsheet technology or wherever you're keeping those, that actual statistical report. So the sign-in sheets are that transitory record that's informing this more substantive record, and so those can be dispositioned after they're obsolete. For records that say permanent archival, is this satisfied by binder in the closet or bin in the basement, or is there something more? So permanent archival, like I was saying before, it's not going to specifically lay out binder or anything like that. So if those records are in a place where they're safe, so that they're safe from dangers of water and fire and insects and theft, and the appropriate people have access to them, and people who shouldn't have access to them don't have access to them. If all of those things are managed, and also if you know where they are in case they ever were damaged, so you would understand what permanent records were lost, as long as you can account for all of those things, that may be appropriate. And I would say basement wise, and I appreciate everybody's very short on space, but basements, as we saw this past summer, are the most prone to flooding and not always the best place, but sometimes that's your only option. Great. All right. Well, I do encourage folks to reach out to myself and my colleagues at Vasara. I would give a real quick plug. I have colleagues with the Vermont Historic Records Program who speak specifically to preservation concerns for your permanent archival records, and they can help you understand, the how do you manage threats like humidity control and that sort of thing, and they would be happy to speak with you about that. So if you reach out to Vasara, I can get you in touch with them. Great. Well, thank you, everybody.
Awesome. This is Lauren Kelly at the Department of Libraries. Just thanking everyone for joining us. There is a survey link. I'm going to stop the recording now, but thank you, Steve.